clearly my reputation precedes me as being introduced to the dangerous but there you go. I'm going to be talking about a study that I talked about at last year's conference, but it's kind of expanded at this time. We're basically looking at ratings or judgments made about different vignettes about domestic violence, where the perpetrator gender and the victim gender is varied, to really explore what people view about those different dynamics, how acceptable they view those different kind of scenarios, whether there's any differences in humour, frequency, beliefs about frequency, and perpetrator-victim blame. We found some interesting stuff which I'll go through, and hopefully it'll chime a little bit with some of the presentations we've had already. For example, Mark's presentation about politics, and Warren's presentation as well. So, as has been highlighted, and this becomes less and less of a kind of like a, wow, look at these stats kind of thing every year, because more and more people are becoming aware of it. So domestic violence can take a number of forms, including physical, emotional, verbal, economic, and sexual abuse, which can range from subtle coercive forms to marital rape and violent physical abuse, and results in disfigurement and death. Over the past kind of 18 months, we've had 1.4 million women and 700,000 men suffer some form of domestic abuse. And that statistic, initially, when I looked it up, was very shocking to me, because I thought it was much less in terms of the male victimisation. And when I spoke to colleagues of mine, again, people that you maybe think are kind of quite open and liberal and enlightened, they would go, well, how do you do research in that area on male victims? Because there aren't any, are there? Well, there clearly are. And from this, we see that it's a persistent and pervasive problem that affects people across gender, which is a more and more accepted attitude, which is something that we're all kind of partly responsible for, I think. The problem is, however, is that domestic violence is still predominantly seen as a crime with female victims. Men are often cast as the aggressive and violent perpetrators, and we therefore have built up a societal schema for domestic violence and what domestic violence looks like. So if we search online, you type in domestic violence, this is what you get as all your results, and you can see this is a very classic, stereotypical depiction of domestic violence. A vulnerable woman being aggressively attacked by a man. So we have this idea in society of what domestic violence looks like, and when people violate this, and I'm going to be talking about, controversially at Male Psychology Conference, I'm going to be talking about male victims, but I'm also going to be talking about female victims in homosexual relationships, and also male partners in male victims in heterosexual relationships, and male victims in homosexual relationships as well. But the archetypal schema that we have is a male aggressively attacking a female, and when men do become victims and women perpetrators, that violates our schemas, and we come up with some way of kind of dismissing it, downplaying it, excusing it or ignoring it, because it doesn't fit in with what we think should be the case. And that's partly because of the way that men and women are socialised and the way that we are taught about our roles, very crudely and very simply in terms of this diagram, where men are socialised into these positions of power and dominance and assertiveness, very broadly where women are socialised into these positions of powerlessness, passivity, weakness, and we also socialised and taught, and through our exposure in the media, into different roles within these crimes, within these gender crimes. Okay, and I gave a talk about sexual violence, which is another area of interest of mine, research-wise, and it always comes out really weird. It always comes out really weird in terms of research. But in terms of, when I walk down the street at night, I do so without any threat, quite merrily, and I just walk home. I don't have this idea in my mind that I might become a victim of sexual violence. Whereas women, I don't know, I'm not a woman, but women have told me that they think about it in a very different way when they're walking home at night, and they do different actions. So, for example, if someone was following me on the pavement, I would just keep on walking, because I don't view myself, I don't have it in my mind, it's not part of my role as a male that I might become a victim, whereas women say they often cross the road. I don't know whether that resonates with any of the women in the room. And because of that, we have very ingrained positions within these crimes that we feel that we would take if it were to happen. And there's not a lot of scope for violation. So what we have to ask is, well, what happens when those are violated? What happens when men become victims, when women are perpetrators? How do we make that fit with what we already know? Or do we even bother? Or is there even exposure that we get in the media to want to ask ourselves that question? Those are all things I don't think really happen. But there are consequences that come with that, which is that men are much less likely than women to report domestic violence, for example, which you might argue self-fulfilling prophecy. So you are a male, you're in a heterosexual relationship, you become the victim of interpersonal violence, and you think to yourself, wait a minute, I'm a man, I'm meant to be strong, I'm meant to be physically tougher, I'm meant to be mentally stronger. Well, I can't be a victim. I've got to come up with some way of rationalising that behaviour. So I either think, well, I'm not really a victim. Maybe I did something to deserve it. Maybe I'm not really a victim at all. Maybe I'm making too much of this. Or you accept all those things, you just don't do anything about it. Because you might have accepted your own role violation, but you don't want other people to know about your role violation. And what this leads to is, because of this threat to masculinity and machismo and this threat of ridicule that we get, there is this issue where people don't report, and you get lack of support from social network, for example. And this has got a lot of qualitative support, and 2 people presented last male psychology conference about qualitative support for that. Focus group saying, yeah, I wouldn't really tell anyone, I'd feel embarrassed, I'd feel ridiculed. And also people who haven't been victims in focus groups saying, yeah, we'd probably call them a bit of a pussy, don't understand how that would happen. Police also, there's a massive issue with how the police receive victims of these crimes, male victims of these crimes. Because they don't understand. It violates their schemes of what domestic violence is meant to look like. How could that happen to you? I don't quite understand that. And in the criminal justice system as a whole, in terms of things like sentencing, if those cases get to court, how do you think that juries look at male and female victims? Because everybody has the schema in their mind of what domestic violence looks like to them. If you've got a man there as a potential victim, well, I don't really see how that would happen. And this is just reiterating that there's little research on men's experiences of abuse, and the research that does exist suggests that research on women does not necessarily apply to men. So we don't even really have many models that examine why men would become victims, other than the fact that they're in abusive relationships and they're people. Gender clouds and colours the perception of that crime very heavily. And when we look a bit more in depth in the kind of themes that come out of police research, so this is research on male victims' experiences of the criminal justice system by one of my research partners at Teesside, how the crime gets completely recast when male victims are picked up by the police. So there's guilty until proven innocent things. So if a male calls the police to their house, they often get cast as the perpetrator. You've called the police as a victim, you often get arrested. Because in the police's mind, in society's mind, there's no way you could be a victim. It's a threat to the masculine identity. There's a pressure cooker in terms of the psychological impact. Everything building up, all the self-hatred of you becoming a victim, all the self-misunderstanding. How could this have happened to me? And the reporting a generally negative experience with the criminal justice system as well. Now, on top of that, in addition to all of that issue and schema, we then introduce an even lesser explored element of this, which is domestic violence in homosexual relationships. And this is both male-male relationships and female-female relationships. That adds a whole nother layer of complexity. Because you have different systems of attitudes at play when you're assessing male-male and female-female domestic violence. Not least because of gender. Because this model, this model is easy to understand. This model fits in with a political narrative, especially about an oppressive group and an oppressed group. A strong male, a dominant male, a patriarchal male abusing a woman. It fits in with those roles in general. What happens when we have 2 people of the same sex coming up against each other in this? I don't know. I haven't really figured it out properly. I'm asking you, if anything. Because what happens when you come and you get called to a male-male scenario? How do you figure that one out? They're both men. They're both strong. Who would have started that? Who's the real aggressor here? What about when you get called to a female-female incident? I didn't even know women could be violent. Are women violent? What's that all about? Someone go, yeah. But, this is the thing. There's no space for this. in our minds, especially in police officers' minds, and turn up and go, lesbian domestic violence? I don't think so. Now, when you add in sexuality to that as well, in terms of power, how those power systems work in homosexual relationships, okay, the different attitudes that people have about how power works in homosexual relationships, okay, well, you're gay, but who's the man? Yeah, does everyone recognise that question in terms of homosexual relationship? Yeah, well, who's the man, who's the woman? So it's about where the power in that domestic violence lies. So there's lots and lots and lots of different questions that we need to be asking about not only the underreported and under-examined crimes of female or male domestic violence, but also male and male domestic violence, and even less so, I mean, there's nothing, absolutely nothing, on female-female domestic violence. So, as a starting point and as an exploratory study, we just wanted to know, when you present people with these scenarios, what do they think and what do they judge? It's difficult to make predictions, for all the reasons I've just said, but we did make some, and it was very kind of victim-focused in terms of where these effects would be. But we broadly thought that men, they would judge domestic violence towards men as more acceptable than domestic violence towards women, because of the way it fits in with what our view of domestic violence is. They would judge domestic violence towards males as less frequently occurring than domestic violence towards women, again, because it fits in with what we view of that crime. Judge domestic violence towards men as more humorous than domestic violence towards women, and that's because in the study last year we did find that effect. And judge male victims of domestic violence as more to blame for their victimisation. I'll be talking about that in a second. Now this slide is more for the psychology people among you, just to see what we did and how we did it. But essentially, we created vignettes, little stories about a crime, an instance of domestic violence, and we just switched the genders, making 4 different vignettes. Okay, so it's either a male on a male, male on a female, female on a male, or a female on a female. And we just got them, participants, undergraduates, to answer those 5 questions. How acceptable do you view this humorous? Who's more to blame? And this was the scenario. This is the female on male. So Kelly and Chris have been arguing for the past 4 days. Kelly has been getting frustrated that Chris has been spending a lot of money from their joint bank account. The bills are supposed to be paid in 2 days, and Chris has asked Kelly to pay for his half once again. They start arguing, and then Kelly calls Chris back and punches him in the face. Okay, so it's quite a simplistic, maybe a slightly crude example of domestic violence, but it's an occurrence of physical abuse. I mean, there are a lot of different variations you could do on this. But interestingly, a couple of these results did come around. So, what did we find? Well, violence towards males, and this is regardless of the perpetrator, so whether it's a female or a male, domestic violence towards males was judged as more acceptable than it is towards females, regardless of the perpetrator. Intriguingly, there's also an interaction between the 2 factors, so it mattered about the perpetrator as well. When it was a male perpetrator, violence towards men was more acceptable than it was towards women. When there was a female perpetrator, there was no difference. This is what that looks like. So this is on a scale of 1, not very acceptable, to 7, very acceptable. Now, encouragingly, we're down on the 1 side of things, so people still thought it was not acceptable. But when you have a male perpetrator, you can see that when it's a female victim, everyone's like, definitely not acceptable, 100% not acceptable. But there's a significant difference when it's a male victim. So in homosexual relationships, it's more acceptable for a male to be domestic violent towards another male than it is for a male to be domestic violent towards a female. When it's a female perpetrator, I guess people are just like, oh, I don't know, I've never seen that before, and they just judge it as equally unacceptable, but probably don't really know what to say because it's a female perpetrator, and they're going, why are they punching people in the face? I didn't think that happened. But that's an interesting effect for me because it shows the importance of looking at the sexuality and the homosexual side of things as well as the heterosexual side of things. Because not only do we have kind of less, it's more acceptable for male victims to be abused, that's particularly prevalent and salient within male-male relationships. Okay, why? Domestic violence towards males is less frequently occurring than domestic violence towards women. Well, this wasn't supported. Interestingly, it was the perpetrators that came out of things People think that there are more male perpetrators than there are female perpetrators. Again, that's support for this idea that we have in our minds of the violence. Now, interestingly, the results from last year in terms of humour, or encouraging, I would say, have gone. So it just showed maybe it was a specific sample. So there was no differences in how funny people thought domestic violence was. In a smaller sample that we had, people thought domestic violence towards men was funnier than domestic violence towards women. And maybe that signifies a bit of change that we've had over the past maybe 2 years. Well, I don't think so, but there's been a lot of videos on social experiments talking to that. And also, last thing was that, and this to me is the most interesting, people judge male victims of domestic violence as more to blame for their victimisation than female victims. So when that has occurred, so when domestic violence towards a man has occurred, people are like, maybe in their minds thinking, well, maybe he did something to provoke that, or maybe he did something to deserve it. And again, it might be a way of rationalising why that has occurred, and why that man has become a victim. And this is a clip that I'm not going to show now, but I have shown before, and if you want to look at it, it's a clip from Friends, best TV show, where Joey gets a girlfriend who's very kind of tiny, but she's continually like beating him up in every conversation they have, in a playful way. So going, you know, don't make fun of me because of my size, and punching him, and he's hurt and says to his friends, you know, she keeps punching me, and they all like, oh, come on guys, we have to be serious, Joey's having a problem with being beaten up by a little girl, and it's all very funny, it's all very human. And this is part of the way that that idea of male victims of domestic violence in the media is depicted as something that is funny, it's not that serious, that they might have done something to deserve it, etc., etc. Now, the implications for me, well, all participants judge domestic violence as not acceptable, not funny, fairly frequently occurring, and they blamed the perpetrators, not the victims, most of the time on the scale. So overall, that's pretty good, actually. However, when the differences do occur, we have to think about why they're occurring. Because we can see that there's a particular problem for male victims in terms of acceptability. So generally it's viewed as more acceptable, albeit not a lot, but it is, for men to be abused rather than women, particularly in gay relationships. And that, for me, is a huge impact and policy implication for policing and awareness campaigns, things like the Stop Gay Domestic Violence campaign. And what we need to move towards, and what I've been working with Jess at Teesside to look at, is how we further bring, and I say further as opposed to bring, I would have said last year, further bring male domestic violence into public consciousness, and even more so, bring more research on female victims of female perpetrators, and a very gender inclusive, to borrow a phrase from Mark, approach to issues like domestic violence, because clearly it's what we need. Clearly there's still some differences, clearly there's still some way to go. I think we are making progress though, because when I searched for domestic violence, this is what I got. Now 2 years ago I did the same search, and does anybody spot anything that I might not have found 2 years ago on this page? I'll give you a little clue. There's a little section now, and it says, do you also want to look at pictures of men being abused? I mean, it's a horrible question for people to ask. But there is now a section that says men, and when you click on it, look at all these images. I did this search 2 years ago. There were none. There were absolutely none. And I really speak to the vibe of this conference, which is very different to the vibe of last conference, which is that we are making an impact. We are making a difference, and we are bringing certain things to the public consciousness, such as male domestic violence and male victims, and starting to chisel a little niche and a little space for different versions of these crimes to occur. Because, I would argue, that's what we need to do, because even though domestic violence and sexual violence tend to be very gendered crimes, does that mean we can ignore the smaller part of the pie chart? Obviously not. I just want to acknowledge the undergraduate student who kind of gathered this data, and Jess and Anna, who I work with very closely, and we have the DBAC group, which is the Domestic Violence Against People group, to try and further this agenda of gender inclusive research that doesn't leave any of these victims out, no matter how small they may be in a participant group. Thank you very much.